Hey, good evening or morning, whatever time you watch this. This is for the week of April 13th. It's actually going to be a relatively short lecture compared to some other lectures. Next week will actually be a little bit longer. We're going to get in a lot of stuff with westward expansion. What we're looking at today is, your chapter is about religion, Reformation, and the New South. Now, we already talked a lot about, or not the New South, the South during this period, the antebellum South. Now, we already talked about that in a previous lecture, so I'm really not going to talk about that much at all. So, we're going to focus on basically uh, the Second Great Awakening, religion or education reform, other reforms, and then we're going to talk also about millennial groups and utopian socialists and transcendentalists and really all kinds of different things. This chapter is honestly kind of a hodgepodge. So before we get started, one thing I think I should mention is yesterday I watched Tiger King because my girlfriend asked me to. It was odd. I went ahead and put it in the general discussion, a thread. So if you want to talk about it, because apparently everybody's talking about it, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I would generally say that none of those people are good people at all. The people who were focused on, they all seem pretty terrible to me. But that's just kind of me. I had no idea we had that many tigers in captivity. All right, so let's talk about this. In the early 1800s, we see the beginnings of the Second Great Awakening. This is where you're going to begin to see a lot more revival meetings. You still kind of see them in the summer. Unfortunately, you still have some people trying to do them today. And I say unfortunately because people need to social distance. One of the largest meetings during this time actually occurred in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801. Um, these revival meetings could last for a week and attract up to 3,000 people and 100 preachers. Basically, they would be preaching around the clock. So it's kind of coming in and kind of coming out kind of thing. And you thought your church services were long. Um, so we begin to see a lot more religious camp meetings. There was a belief again that mainstream preachers had become too intellectual. They blamed the problems of the world on materialism that was a result of the market revolution. Remember that from a couple of lectures ago. Um, the concern about money and business interest really began to bother the religious folk. Now, one of the main figures of this movement was a man named Charles G. Finney. Actually, looked for a decent little biography on him to show you guys, and they were all religiously slanted, so I didn't want to open up that can of worms. He was a lawyer who had turned into a preacher. He actually used the tools of the market revolution and what he learned as a lawyer to reach his followers. Um, According to him, he kind of had a Paul on the way to Damascus moment where Jesus like talked to him and said, "You need to change your ways and whatnot," and like start preaching. So, what's going to be different from this in this second Great Awakening from the first? Well, first of all, what we see is a rejection of predestination. Remember, the Presbyterian, the Calvinists said that everything had already been determined. Uh, God had already written everything down in the book of life, and there were no surprises. There's no free will. In the Second Great Awakening, they are going to reject that. They're going to stress free will. And what he said was you could seek out salvation perfectly. And what this was about was a strive for perfection, realizing that you can never get there, but the idea was to find some form of religious perfection in this case. Um, there was actually this book I read a long time ago called Jonathan Livingston Seagull that kind of explored this idea of reaching perfection and getting into the next realm and all that. It's a really good book. Highly recommend it. It's really short. What else you got to do, right? You're stuck at home. So, what Finney and others wanted were for people to aim for perfection. And they said if we reach that perfection, then we could usher in the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's always about that. Sobriety and hard work was very important. This movement appealed to the middle class and the wealthy, who then made their working class people go. Finney was very popular in towns along the Erie Canal. And as I said, they used democratic political techniques to reach their followers. They also used the new technologies to produce more Bibles and pamphlets. And we began to see the beginnings of a temperance movement during this time, where you're going to see people advocate abstinence from alcohol. And honestly, it was kind of understandable because by 1830, consumption of alcohol was 7 gallons per person per year, or a typical college weekend. Put in another way, that 7 gallons per person per year is about twice of what people drink today. Drunkenness was becoming a problem. It was not originally considered a sin by most Christians. At first, they went for moderation. In fact, in the Puritan days, they kind of drunk this beer kind of thing for breakfast because it's easier to get than water. The first temperance national organization appeared in 1826. By the mid 1830s, there will be 232 temperance groups, 1.5 million members. Evangelicals will begin to push temperance, but alcohol will not be the only cause for reformers. Another thing that will come about during this time is education reform. There was a belief by many that we needed to educate everyone or we could not prosper as a society. The leading figure of the education movement is a man named Horace Mann, Mann. I'm going to include a little video about him. What he wanted, he was from Massachusetts, he wanted a uniform curriculum for his students. And what he did is this led to the creation of a state board of education. He believed that if there was more education, there would be less crime. He also wanted to make good citizens and workers. There's always a citizenship part. There's a little bit of indoctrination in really honestly, pretty much any education program, you're going to have kind of some, you're going to really have some sort of indoctrination. It's just kind of how it's going to be. What he began to do, and we see this today, is he began to assign students to grade levels based on their age and ability. Something we pretty much do today. A few years ago in Kentucky, under the Kentucky Education Reform Act, they tried to go to ungraded primaries, and it was an absolute disaster. In 1836, we began to see textbooks like the McGuffey Reader. The McGuffey Reader, which you can still find copies of today, had pearls of wisdom like, quote, "Don't envy your social betters, for it is God's will that some people are rich and others are not." So that's the type of wonderful messaging you got from textbooks back then. You thought our textbooks were bad today. The Working Man's Party also wanted to use education to promote equality. And during this time, we will see the beginnings of more and more colleges, most of which will be affiliated with the new religions of the Second Great Awakening. So that's Horace Mann. Like I said, I'm going to have a video kind of talking a little bit more about him as we kind of go along. There's also a move to reform prisons. One of the moves was to separate the mentally ill from the prison population. This is where we begin to see the sanitariums. You know, each state basically had at least one sanitarium. Waverly Hill in Kentucky, and there's a place in Nashville. We know those to be fairly cruel places where they like electrocuted people and whatnot to try to make their brains work right. But believe it or not, at the time, that was real progress. You also begin to see kind of a move to begin to reform criminals, use it as an opportunity not just to punish, but to rehabilitate. And that's kind of the Pennsylvania model. So we begin to see kind of that move toward a more just prison during this time. So this is also kind of a time where we see abolitionists. We talked about, I gave you guys last week that video about Cassius Clay and how abolitionists wanted to end slavery immediately. This is a time where we see a lot of people just are not willing to compromise. We're not emancipationists. We got abolitionists who want to end slavery immediately. Colonization, it becomes very popular in some circles. We talked about that when we talked about Henry Clay. The idea was they wanted to buy freedom, put former slaves on a boat and send them to Liberia. In fact, we'll send 1,400 former slaves to Liberia. As I mentioned in that Henry Clay lecture, is that frankly, most people, most former slaves, this was their home. This is where they wanted to stay. We also began to see in the North accounts from former slaves. For instance, former slave David Walker, a free black man, will call for insurrection. William Lloyd Garrison will create a newspaper called The Liberator to demand the immediate abolition of slavery. He will organize the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1832. And what's unique about William Lloyd Garrison is that he included men, women, whites, and blacks. So it truly was everybody on board. He will use modern technology to get the word out about abolition and will begin to publish the escapes of slaves like Henry Box Brown, who actually mailed himself in a box. I guess he did put in some holes to breathe. He actually mailed himself from Richmond to Philadelphia in order to get his freedom. So how bad did the South hate abolitionists? Well, the Georgia legislature actually offered rewards for people to actually go to the North and kidnap abolitionists to bring them back to Georgia to put them on trial. They also held book burnings of abolitionist literature. During this time, there are thousands of petitions to end slavery sent to the House and the Senate in Washington, D.C., a lot of which were written by women, by the way. How did they respond? How did our fearless leaders respond? With what was a gag rule. They basically made it illegal to talk about ending slavery. During this time, the North will become more anti-slavery, while the South will become more pro-slavery. In the South, they no longer saw it as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. That peculiar institution John Calhoun talked about. We've talked about John Calhoun before. And we're going to talk a little bit about him now. The Southerners believed that the abolitionists were just stirring up slaves into, slave insurrections. So, and part of that was true. Abolitionists in some cases really were kind of doing that. We're going to kind of see that as we kind of move forward. John C. Calhoun became the leading spokesman for slavery, calling it, as I mentioned, the peculiar institution. What we're seeing is definitely the North and the South not in a position where you can really compromise, though slavery is not really something you can compromise on anyway, I don't think. What about women during this time? Well, this is where it's going to offend you. Or at least it should. Women were seen as having their own sphere, the domestic sphere. Some men will even try to control women sexually. Some women wanted to teach proper sexual and health education. For instance, a woman named Paulina Wright actually gave lectures. Apparently, she was so explicit, some women actually fainted. As I mentioned before, women were really big into the abolitionist movement. They sent a lot of the petitions to end slavery. Women had been active in politics and moral reform from the very beginnings of our country, and they began to organize themselves more. 2/3 of the 70,000 anti-slavery signatures from 1837 to 1838 were women. Women had their own anti-slavery organization. They had a strong anti-abolition. They even had some They even had some anti-abolition groups in the South. When women's group were told, when women's group said they wanted to also include black women in South Carolina to make sure they couldn't meet, they actually burnt down the town's convention center. That's thinking, right? It's like, we're going to stop this one group from having this interracial meeting by burning down the convention center for the entire town. It is brilliant. This is a time where many began to question the legal status of women. Women became legally dead when they got married. What does that mean? Well, single women who did not live at home could inherit property from their father. They can own property. However, the moment they got married, they are legally dead, which means that all of their property becomes the property of their husband. Now, even if there was a divorce, he would, which is very rare during this time, he would still keep the property. Now, say there's some cases where if she becomes a widow, she might get it back, but only if she doesn't have a son. So women are legally dead once they enter marriage. In 1837 in New York, a man named Thomas Hertrell will introduce a bill to give married women more control over the property they held before they came into marriage. It was a step in the right direction. Now, we're also going to begin to see the movement toward women's getting the right to vote. 1848, supporters of women's rights met in Seneca Falls, New York. Cady Stanton, C-A-D-Y Stanton, and Lucretia Mott, M-O-T-T, organized this meeting. 300 men and women, including Frederick Douglass, created the Women's Right Manifesto. And let me find some excerpts from that because we got some time. Doo-doo-doo-doo. All right, here we go. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman. That came out of the Declaration at Seneca Falls. Now, over 24 similar meetings will occur over the next 12 years, and it works because 1920 women get the right to vote. Sometimes it takes time. Frederick Douglass's newspaper supported this, while the mainstream media was not as sympathetic. It even caused a schism in the anti-abolition movement, where you had William Lloyd Garrison arranging the votes to support women's right within his anti-slavery society, which actually caused those who disagree to resign from the anti-slavery. So what you had these white dudes who's like, oh, we totally got to end slavery, give black men the right to vote and treat them well, but by God, don't expect us to treat women as equals. So that's where we begin to see the beginnings of the women's rights movement. It's a very slow process. I hope you guys have some comments about that in the discussion board. So I mentioned we're going to also talk about millennial groups, utopian societies. Millennial groups are not the young people. They are religious groups that believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ is imminent. For instance, during this time, you had William Miller's Millerites. You know you got an ego when you name your group after yourself. They made various doomsday predictions that always ended up being wrong. For me, probably the most interesting with the Kentucky connection are the Shakers, actually formed by Mother Ann Lee of England, and she comes over to this country. Mother Ann Lee is kind of interesting in that, well, I'm going to have a couple of videos about the Shakers, but ultimately, she had a very hard life. She was married. She kept having stillbirth children. she got in her mind that that meant that God didn't want us to procreate anymore. So she also calls herself as the female equivalency of Christ, which is a whole different thing. So she's mistreated in England, thrown in jail. She comes over to this country and she gets a following. And what happens is once you come in, if you're a married couple, then you separate. You live in separate places. You everyone worships in the same hall, but men on one side, women on the other. And you didn't procreate, and you share different jobs, and they were actually very anti-slavery too. To actually join these Shakers, you had to give up all your worldly goods. That included slaves, and slaves were given actual equal membership in there if they wanted. One of my favorite stories is there is a slave woman who was an excellent cook, so they put her in charge of the kitchen, and one of the people who worked for her was her former owner. Um, so the idea was that um, if they lived apart, if they lived a pious life, if they worked hard, and they did a lot of crafty things and built things like the Amish, except for they actually embraced technology, then it would hasten the second coming of Jesus. Now, you might wonder, how do you continue with a religion like that? Well, it's kind of hard. Um, they had converts who often came for the winter and then left. They also adopted a lot of children, and much like the Amish, at certain age they were given the opportunity to go into the world or whatever. Um, so the Shaker Church is actually still with us today. Now, in our area, the last two Shaker women died in the 1980s. There are about 6 or 7 still left in Maine. Here's the deal that they offer you. If you go to become a Shaker, if you stay for 7 years, they will pay all of your worldly debts. Something sometimes I got to admit I've thought about. I'm going to have a video or two about the Shakers. Extra credit opportunity. Well, no, strike that because we can't go anywhere. Normally, I'd give you the opportunity to actually go to the Shaker Village in South Union in Auburn, Kentucky, but you can't go there right now. So, uh, I don't know if you want to do something extra credit with the Shakers. Give me a couple pages on your thoughts on them. Other groups, you had Oneida with complex marriage that basically said you could get with anyone of the opposite sex that you wanted to. I imagine it led to a lot of complex divorce. You also have Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon faith. After 1823, the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. I believe I've talked about Joseph Smith before, but basically the idea was, according to Joseph Smith, the Archangel Gabriel came to him and said, "Dude, did you know Jesus came to America?" And Joseph Smith was like, "Whoa, that's pretty cool. Let's hear more about that." And so he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, here's some plates. Go dig under that tree. You can read the text for yourself and write it down." So that's supposedly what Joseph Smith did. He wrote it down. He gave it to a friend. The friend loved it. The friend's wife said, "How do you know he's not making that stuff up?" And she said, well, there's a good South Park episode about this. So she said, "Why don't you tell him you lost it, see if he can reproduce it. No harm, no foul." So that's what he does. So Joseph Smith is mad. He goes away. He says, "I totally talked to the Archangel Gabriel." He said he was angry that you lost it. He said, "I couldn't look at that text again, but I could look at a similar one, basically the same story, but it'd be a little bit different." And those are the first 2 books of the Book of Mormon. Um, Basically, what they're probably best known for is polygamy, where you were allowed to have as many wives as you could support, which actually, from a religious standpoint, isn't that odd. It's kind of all over the place in the ancient world. Um, we also see secular utopias. Robert Owens has New Harmony, which was a model community of, I think, of 2,040 people. He thought that was the exact number to have a perfect society, where, much like the Shakers, they would swap jobs around without the religious part. There's even an interracial utopia in Nashua. This is also the time of transcendentalism with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. The idea was that we needed a return to nature and to get back to nature. Thoreau was definitely the believer. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the guy making the money. Walden Pond is what you might be familiar with. This is also a time where women are going to write a lot of books, and we began to see slave narrations. We talked about the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. Harriet Jacobs wrote a really, really terrifying book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I'll have a little video about her too. Um, and, it really kind of shined a light on what it was like to be a slave. We also began to see roaming lecture series on things like how to be a confidence man and phrenology. If you don't know phrenology, that's where they kind of fill your head and they can tell if you're a criminal or whatnot and everything about you, apparently. Phrenology is kind of interesting, but I kind of like that they were teaching people how to be con men. In urban areas, you begin to see parks and cemeteries being built. This is where you'll begin to see the beginnings of Central Park. Now, as I said, this is going to be a fairly short lecture, so I really hope that you will watch the videos that I'm going to include with this. I think you're going to find them very interesting. I look forward to having discussions with you. As I said, if you want to talk about Tiger King, it's in general discussion. Next week, be a little bit more work because we're going to watch a documentary and we're going to talk about the West, and we're going to talk about the Mexican War and just all kinds of different fun stuff. So, light week this week, more work next week. Until then, I hope everyone is staying safe. Remember social distancing. Don't go out unless you have to. This is no joke. Be careful. I wish we could all be together in class, but this is how it has to be right now. And by the way, if anyone's looking for a 2020 class to take during the summer, I am teaching one online. It won't be the same as this. It'll be the regular online curriculum, but I'll try to make it better. So until next time, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I will talk to you all later.